Hey y'all, what's up? My name is Jess. Welcome back to Roots and Refuge Farm. Today we are doing a garden tour. I know you guys are super excited. Today is the first full garden tour of the fall of 2020. Fall actually doesn't start for 2 more days, but it's definitely feeling pretty crisp in the mornings. It's warming up in the afternoons here in central Arkansas. I have the opportunity to grow food through the winter in some capacity, not as much as when it's warm, but we will definitely be harvesting food from our farm all throughout this winter, and I want to be able to show that to you guys. Now, right now I'm in my front garden, my big raised bed garden, and there is still some going on out here. There's still some going on in the ground outside in the back, and then of course we have the high tunnel. So let's take a look at this garden. Now over here in the cottage garden, things are pretty weedy and wayward, and that's okay. The really wild stuff over in this garden is gonna die back when it freezes. If the cold weather comes when it usually does, that will be the end of October, the very beginning of November. However, I will tell you, it is cooler now in September than it usually is here. So we'll see. We might end up with a little early winter. I've kind of prepared myself for that. But a lot of this is gonna die back. When it does, we'll come tear a lot of things out. We're gonna plant more bulbs. We're going to mulch the walkways. This garden was a project from the start, and so it's really gotten wild, but that's okay. Now the raised beds are a little bit of a mix right now of some things that have died off and then I'm just gonna save some seeds from, some things that we've replanted, and a lot of empty space because I actually have not replanted a whole lot of stuff back here. We are going to be replacing this garden fence that goes around here. This fence is it's the original fence, which this used to be our chicken yard when we first started our farm. And it was kind of cheap fencing to begin with. It's not welded wire, and it's really saggy, kind of breaking in some places, and the chickens are just invading the garden daily. A lot of the seeds that have been sowed have been scratched up and eaten. It's frustrating, but instead of just staying frustrated about it, I knew that I wasn't ready to bump the fence up to the top of our project list, so I mostly planted in the back. Because sometimes you just kind of got to roll with the punches. So here I've got some carrots. There's some different peas and beans that are growing here. You can see here's some green beans. But as you can see, I think there's only a couple of plants here. Like this would have been lots of green beans, but chickens. Now this right here, these are actually noodle beans that reseeded from what was here. And what I do when something like that happens is I just leave those. Pretty good sized plants. I mean, they're about 10 inches tall or so, and those fell from the noodle beans that were growing there through the spring and summer. If our frost comes early, I won't get anything from those, but if the frost comes late, I'll be able to harvest those. And that's kind of how it is with a fall garden. It's a gamble. Anything that you plant that's kind of going to be close, it's a frost tender thing. As soon as that frost comes, that plant's gone. Frosts have been late before. Last year, our frost didn't come until 2 weeks after it was forecasted with our estimated first frost date. And so all the things that I planted that I was like, oh, it's gonna be right on the edge, we might or might not get anything from this, we were able to harvest quite a bit from those. So I just kind of leave stuff like that, because if I tear it out, I'll get nothing for sure. If I leave it, I might get something. Again, here I've got lots of little random carrots. These are cosmic purples, some different beans down here. These are actually like peas. Let's see if we can see any of them forming. Here we go. Here we've got some different peas starting to form. We'll come up with some sort of like TP trellis right here for these to grow on. And we'll be able to harvest these before the frost. Now down here, these are melons, which have come back on their own. Probably won't get much from these. I don't think we'll have enough time, but I'm gonna leave them and let them grow, because as of right now, I don't have any need for this space. So it's not hurting anything to let them try. My banana plants have been pretty well shredded by all the storms that we've had, but they are beautiful, majestic, probably about 18 feet tall. So those are going to stay, and they'll live until the frost comes. And when the frost comes, they will die back. We don't have a long enough season to grow tropical fruit like bananas without being able to overwinter them in a climate controlled space. I did move one of these in a big pot back into my high tunnel. I don't know if it'll make it this year. I think that if it gets below freezing in the high tunnel, it will die back. But I think if it's allowed to grow this big in there next year, maybe it'll be worth kind of putting some heat on it and just seeing. I think you need to get them through 2 seasons for them to actually bear bananas. My mother has banana plants like this also, really massive ones, and she puts them in pots and she actually takes them into her house in the winter, and literally her living room feels like a jungle because they touch the ceiling. They're just massive trees, but hers actually set bananas. They're small. I really just grow them because they're so beautiful back here in the back corner of the garden. I mean, check that out. It's majestic. And also you can use the leaves in cooking. You can use them like wrapping up roasts and grilling in them and stuff like that. The only thing is they put off a lot of offspring. And so this started as 3 plants. If you can see here now, there are quite a few more. And next year, I'm going to have to thin these out pretty aggressively. I've given away a few of these. We've pulled them out. We moved one to the back, but I'm afraid that if I continue to let them grow more dense, that they're gonna break this raised bed apart. So I'm gonna have to thin that out pretty well in the spring and take back some of the different shoots as they start to grow up. Basically what these do is, I mean, they just turn to like brown mush and we just cut them off, and in the spring, in the middle of the area that we cut off, they send up their little shoot and they start to grow again. All of this growth was this year. Isn't that fascinating? I've got some zinnias back here. They've reseeded a lot, and a lot of times what happens with like my spring flowers is they will reseed and rebloom. So I don't tear any of these out. I leave these, they'll die with the frost, but I might get some more color this year out of them. These chives will live through the winter, and I'll continue to harvest those through the winter. Still got some peppers, which are doing fine. Those are banana peppers. Actually, that is a pretty heavy load right there that needs to be picked. I just haven't picked them because I haven't been ready to process. I'm gonna save the seeds of these okras. I grew all my okra in the back really close together, and these Texas Hill Countries were here all by themselves. It's one of my favorite varieties of okra. Now these are super overdone, but stay really squatty. And you just pick them when they're a little smaller, but they give you these big fat medallions whenever you dice them to fry them or put them in gumbo. Okra is one of the easiest seeds to save, like dry out really well. I will tell you, I'm doing this for this video. Normally when I'm saving seeds for something like this, like okra or dried beans or things that are just like drying up, peas in a pod, in the garden, I usually do that like in the heat of the afternoon, because right now it's like 50 degrees outside. It's damp because it's early. So if you do decide to harvest seeds when it is damp and they're still moist, maybe just lay them out on a paper towel inside before you put them in any bags. You don't ever want to put moisture in your bag of seeds because they'll mold. So okra pods, they grow really large, and if you grew okra this year, you probably learned how quickly they become inedible because they get too big, they get really woody. But then what happens is they dry out like this. You hear those seeds in there? And all you do is you open up each little segment here, and it has seeds inside of it. So you probably could get enough seeds for your own garden from one pod of okra. Inevitably, you're gonna have one that gets bigger than you intended it to get because they grow so fast. And you just save seeds from those. Like a lot of times during the year, I'll let that happen. Now, I let all of these plants go beyond edible because we were still harvesting edible okra from the back of the back garden, and I just let these go. I actually have some other fall plants. We'll get to them over on the other side of this garden. So I'm gonna save the seeds from several of these pods. It'll give me an excess. I'll be able to, you know, take them to seed swap or do something like that, give them away to friends. So I just got this handful of okra seeds from this one pod. It's probably about 40 or 50 seeds in one pod. Now okra really readily cross-pollinates, so if you had multiple varieties growing next to each other, you probably end up with some sort of cross. That's not a problem. It'll still be edible okra. It just, like, if I had this little squatty Texas Hill Country pod growing next to like an emerald or a, you know, Clemson spineless, like a long skinny green pod, the progeny of those two would probably be something in between them. It would not be quite so squatty, not quite so red, but it wouldn't be quite so slim and green as the other one. And that's fine. So if you're just looking for sustainability, you can save your okra seeds even if they, you know, you grew multiple varieties and they might be crossed. If you're looking to produce an offspring that's like the parent plant, you want to save where they weren't close to other plants. And I have other okra in this garden. These still could be cross-pollinated, but it's not as likely with them being over here by themselves. I also don't care if they are. Some of the best okra I ever had was an accidental hybrid that grew in my garden. And now I have a pocket full of seeds. This is what happens every time I come out here. Now this right here is probably my favorite part of the garden at this current moment, up here in the front at least. This is everything that I hoped that it would be. You know, midsummer we decided we would probably want some happy colorful for fall. Filled this bed up with a variety of sunflowers. The seeds are from Johnny's. They were actually sent to us by a viewer. And then here, this is the Cactus Zinnia mix from Haas Tools. So it's just a mix of zinnias on both sides. And these are truly extraordinary. The bees are loving them. I can see them from the window up where our dining room is. And I just am so happy about this. So here's some different empty space, and like these are just weeds that have kind of overrun this area. There are some pepper plants down in here, but they're pretty well choked out at this point. Look, there's a few peppers here. Pumpkin spice jalapenos. But those weeds are pretty intense. These are dahlias. These come back every year. Just really pretty, and they're kind of spread out right now because there's nothing around them. And here are blue butterfly peas, which are used. You can use these for food coloring. You can make a tea out of them. That is supposed to be pretty good for just like relaxation. I have actually not done that, but I plant these just about every year, and they are also prolific seed producers. So they make these little pods here. When they dry up, you just take the seeds out of them, and as you can see, all of these. Now the seeds, the pods are not edible. These are really, I mostly just grow them because they're really beautiful. Blue flowers are very unusual in nature. That's just one of the least common things to see, and that's why I like these. I just think it's neat to see them growing. Oh, here's a goose. They've been hanging out here a lot. Hey, Goosey. So Artie the artichoke bloomed and then died back and is making his way back up again. He will die back again when it freezes, but then come back in spring. A lot of times I leave things like zinnias, even when they're looking kind of scraggly, or basil once it's well bolted, just for the bees during this time of year, because I don't have nearly as much like blooming. Over here I've got just a mess of holy basil. Check this out. I love to leave this and let it drop its seeds, because then I don't have to plant it next year. All of this holy basil volunteered from last year, because when we got to the end of the year I just left it, and so that's gonna happen again. And check this out. These are actually all holy basil sprouts from seeds that dropped from these plants. Here we have some fall squash. They're really not doing very well. They're really not making much fruit because they are pretty sickly. It's powdery mildew. I've sprayed them a few times, but we've just had so much rain, so it kind of is what it is. There's some, like this one over on the edge is looking fairly healthy. It's got a few young squash on it. We'll see. Here, the Malabar spinach, sort of winding down a bit with the cooler nights. I think is probably slowing this down. But again, I just let these drop its seeds, and then I'll have Malabar spinach here next year. These zinnias are so tall. They're really, really beautiful. This was a volunteer that I just allowed to grow, and I've taken many dried heads and thrown them back in the bed here. Parsley, I've harvested a lot of this, and I will harvest more soon and just dry it to use over the winter. But that has been really prolific this year and done really well. Now here I've got some okra that was re-sowed for the fall. I've got a few different kinds. Gosh, those are looking pretty. Those are really lovely marigolds. Here's more okra. I had some more harvestable basil here. I've been picking off of this. Some of these have gone to seed, but some of it's okay. This big plant is a roselle, which is grown for tea. It hasn't done anything yet, so I'm hoping that it does before the frost comes, because this is a member of the marshmallow family, and it is frost tender. More basil. So down here on the end, this is probably the most exciting part of the garden for me right now, because my roses have gotten a second wind and they're looking really, really pretty. As you can see, these were all planted late in the spring. It was actually a little late to plant roses, and I hoped that they would not suffer because of that. This one is supposed to be a shrub rose, and it is definitely growing very reachy, so I'm gonna have to figure out some sort of support back here for them. But I'm really happy, and I'm imagining next year these being like really big anchors here on the back of the garden. This bed is ginger, which I am going to let this go until right before the frost is supposed to come, and then I'll harvest it. I want to give it as much time as possible to grow. And then down this row where the tomatoes were, we have a lot of like cow peas growing. That's what these are, is cow peas. And they're looking pretty good. They're starting to make some food on here. And just some random beans. Now, this would have been fuller except for them. Which I can't really be that mad at them. They're just acting like chickens. It's really on us for not having the proper fencing. We have clipped their wings, but they can even get over a 4-foot fence with that. It's not even that they're getting over it. In some places they're getting under it. And that's where, you know, we'll chase them out, try to patch the places that they're coming in, and they find new places. And we finally just decided, like, it's not worth the frustration of this. I am planning on putting some things out here, some transplanted brassicas, to just see, but it is really a gamble because I'm not planning on putting any covers over them. I'm not going to build my little cold frames row covers over these beds because I'm really gonna focus on the greenhouse, and I can produce enough food in the greenhouse for our family over winter. I don't really need this, and so I'm mostly just gonna let this rest over the winter. Hey dudes, what's up?
What's up? What's up?
I didn't see you come up behind me. Where are you going?
In the woods.
Oh, y'all are going in the woods? Okay. We'll have fun.
Okay.
See ya. Here I've got some more Tanya's pink potted beans. I've been picking some of these, but my whole point in growing this little bit was to have seed stock for next year. So a lot of these are just gonna go to seed saving. These are one of my favorite beans because they're hot pink. And the seeds can be kind of hard to find, so I wanted to make sure that I had enough to grow a pretty significant row next year. That's pretty much it for here in the front. As you can hear, my farm and my family are waking up. It's getting a little bit later on in the morning. Let's head back to the backyard and check out, because that's really where most of the fall stuff is happening. All right, so this was Ben Turn's project back here. It's done pretty well. Basically what this was an experimental attempt at a Three Sisters garden. How pretty is that? And in some regards, this is working how it's meant to. You can see here, we've got these beans are growing up, the sunflowers. Here are some beans growing all over. There's a sunflower, and this is a japonica corn, which you can tell is beautiful, variegated. It's tasseling, so we'll see what that does. So Three Sisters gardening is a Native American gardening practice. And basically what Native Americans would do is plant corn, and they would interplant beans or peas, something that climbs, that's a nitrogen fixer, which aids the corn, which is a heavy nitrogen feeder, as well as squash. And they would plant squash along the bottom, which would essentially like ramble and keep the weeds down. And squash is also a heavy feeder. And the idea is that growing the three of those together is that they all would benefit from growing near each other. Because the beans would climb the corn, the squash would keep the weeds down, the beans would fix the soil, where the squash and the corn would take from the soil. And it's a really interesting practice. Now, here in this garden, Ben Turn planted this to try to decide it. Now, when we planted this, we knew there would be a chance that we would not harvest any of this corn because there wouldn't be time. And we decided to grow it anyway just to see how this grew. With that said, the corn seeds that we used were a little bit old. I tell people all the time, seeds will last for a really long time if you keep them cool and dry. I know Luke at My Gardener actually sprouted and grew some 87-year-old tomato seeds that he had gotten from a shadow box. Corn seeds are probably the most titchy about being saved, and they lose their rate of germination really fast. So some of these seeds that were grown here, did not sprout. So the way this corn is growing right now is not ideal. You really want to plant your corn in blocks. You really want to have it densely planted so that it will pollinate with the other corn stalks around it. The other thing is, so this is something I actually just learned this year about corn, and I was a little confused about this because I had read really contradicting information. So if you're growing tomatoes and you have like the seeds for a red Abe Lincoln and the seeds for a Berry's Crazy Cherry, which is a little yellow cherry tomato that grows in clusters, and you plant those seeds and they grow next to each other, that red Abe Lincoln is going to produce those red Abe Lincoln fruits, and the Berry's Crazy Cherry is going to produce those yellow cherry tomato fruits. As long as those seeds weren't cross-pollinated the generation before, that's what they'll grow. Now, if they cross to one another and the pollen from one of those reaches the blossoms of the other plant, they can cross-pollinate, being right next to each other. With tomatoes, they don't super readily do that because they have everything they need in each blossom to pollinate themselves. So a lot of times you can just save seeds from tomatoes without doing anything at all to keep them from cross-pollinating, and you're gonna get something like what you saved the seeds from. If they do cross-pollinate, the red tomato is still going to be a red tomato, the cherry tomato is still going to be a cherry tomato, but the seeds inside those tomatoes, when you plant them the next year, are going to grow a mix of the two if they were crossed, and you get all kinds of things in a first generation of a cross like that. Now corn, I learned this year, is actually different because what you're actually getting and what you're actually harvesting from the corn is the seed itself. So when we eat corn, we're eating seed. It's just immature seeds, that's what you're eating. And so if you have two varieties of corn growing very near to each other, they can affect the seeds in that first generation. So it was very fascinating. I asked this question and I received a lot of messages and emails and photos where you guys showed me where you grew two corns next to each other and you would peel back an ear and it would look almost exactly like it was supposed to, except for have a little section that looked like, you know, a mix of the other kind that it was growing. It was really, really neat. But the reason is because those are actually the seeds. So if the seeds are cross-pollinated, they might look a little different, which I thought that was really cool. And right here, part of what we're doing right here is kind of testing that out. So there are multiple varieties of corn that are growing here and tasseling all at the same time. And the other thing I learned is if you want to grow multiple varieties of corn that you don't want to cross-pollinate, stagger the planting by about 2 or 3 weeks. And that way they tassel at different times, so they won't be putting pollen out while the other one is receiving pollen. These are all tasseling at the same time though, and I'm hoping that we have the time to harvest them, and if they are mixed, that it'll be an interesting experiment. Now the other thing that happened in this experiment is very sad. Isn't this japonica just extraordinary? It has pink on it. Beans are climbing nicely. You may notice the absence of the squash in my garden here. So what I really have going on here is like a two bereaved sisters garden, because the squashy sister succumbed to squash bugs. They were really intense, and we planted winter squash all throughout here, and they were dead very quickly. I mean, the squash bugs were just so intense. They died back pretty quick, and that is very typical of here. I have talked to a lot of people in this area who garden, like whenever people will stop by, especially people that are quite a bit older than me and have been gardening here for a long time, and I'll say, hey, what do you do about squash bugs? And they're like, oh, just throw some 7 Dust on there. I garden organically, so it's not really an option for me. And so I've just learned to plant the squash really early, stay on top of it as much as I can, harvest as much as I can, and then say goodbye to it. So because we planted this like mid-summer, the squash bugs were kind of at their peak. They'd already taken out all my other squash, and they took out the third sister as well. So that stinks. We didn't really get the full experience of doing the Three Sisters garden. We may try it again in the spring. Now here is the patch where we dug sweet potatoes, and if you can see, there are quite a few areas where they've started to grow again. Those are just from little bits that got left in the ground. they're probably, these won't produce anything because sweet potatoes take 120 days. It'll freeze before those get to produce. However, we still have this section up here to dig, and that's on the to-do list this week. The ones at the top of this slope were a little smaller, and I decided to wait. And I wonder if it's just because the water and the nutrients flowed downhill here, because down towards the bottom they were massive, but up here they were a little smaller, so I gave them a little more time. Here is the potato patch, and actually there are some potato plants growing up here. I'm hoping that in harvesting these sweet potatoes back, those will have the opportunity to grow more, and we'll get another smaller round of potatoes here in the fall. And here are the Jerusalem artichokes, the sunchokes. And they seem to be doing okay. I think they're supposed to be bigger, so I'm thinking I might bring some like blood meal or something in here and feed these guys and allow them to grow a little more. This yard is kind of a weed jungle right now. We usually let the goats eat down whenever things get like this, but obviously they would not respect the gardens if we put them in here. So this is where our in-ground garden was, and it's just a little tilled space, but I am actually transferring this over to a no-dig area. We did till it under one more time. You can see there are some things here that are growing, volunteering from what was here before. Like here's some squash, and over there, there's some melons, some beans. My plan for this is we're going to actually take, here soon, in the next couple of weeks, we're gonna take an electric fence and run it around here, and we're going to put some chickens in here. And what they will do is effectively scratch through everything. All these little volunteer plants that are growing right now, they'll eat those. And I'm thinking right now, we have to build the little coop. We're actually gonna use Justin Rhodes' plans for his chickshaw and build a little chickshaw for in here so we can move that around and use chickens to clear out old gardening spaces. And also they will add nutrients back to this soil. So we'll leave them on here for a couple of months, and then we will take them off and mulch it really heavily to prepare to plant it again in the spring. Here in the next 2 or 3 days before we bring them out here, I think we're talking about trying to get them out here within a few weeks, but here in the next few days, I've got a whole bunch of seeds for like beets and mustards and radishes. I got them from Haas Tools, like in big packages to do microgreens, and I think I'm gonna take some of those and just broadcast them over this space. The chickens will scratch those out, but that way there will be something growing here and the weeds won't get carried away while we're still waiting to put the chickens back here. And of course I'm leaving those volunteers because those will be chicken food. All right, so this is gonna be the star of the garden tour show this winter, the high tunnel. Oh, it's so nice in here. We just harvested all of these peppers last night. We had pulled a bunch of plants out, and we're going to amend it. I need to gather these up. I just didn't have a basket whenever we picked them all. I had the water going in here this morning, so I just had to come back here and turn it off. Now over here on the side are rutabagas, kales, and beets. Now some of these here, like these kales, are sowed fairly thickly, and instead of just thinning those and pulling those off, I'm actually gonna take these and thin them out. So right here I have like 5 plants growing together. And one thing I can do here is, if I'm careful, I can kind of dig down next to this and loosen up the roots and just sort of tease the roots out for one of these. So you see that? This isn't ideal. This isn't like the best way to do it, but the alternative is to just cut this off and kill it. And I can take this, and like down here where the germination wasn't as good, the soil is really moist because the strip line was just running. So I definitely want to put this in moist soil because it doesn't have a lot of roots. So it's gonna have a little harder time soaking up moisture at first until it gets established. But I can just stick that down in here. It's gonna shock a little bit and wilt at first, but that plant will take root and be just fine. So I think probably what happened here, because you can see germination's pretty sparse up here, but it's kind of thick, some of the seeds probably just washed down. And so that's what I'll do sometimes. Like here, it's kind of thick with the Rutabagas. And I'm just gonna take those little seedlings and just move them around. And if I have any extras down here, I'll put them up in some other area of the high tunnel. So right now, we have only left the peppers that we are regularly using fresh or that I wanna make more hot sauce from. So here, these are like a lemon drop pepper. And I want to make more hot sauce from these. I've kind of experimented with that. I've made a little bit of hot sauce. These are the habanadas. I'm loving eating these fresh, so I left those. Here, jalapenos, loving eating these, so I left those. But like here is where our ground cherries were. We took that out. I left a couple of these little eggplants that I felt like still had some time. And a lot of these peppers, like there was a bunch of cayennes here, and I've already harvested so many that I didn't need anymore, so we went ahead and took those out. Same thing over on the other side. A lot of the drying chilies, we already kind of had enough of those and we took them out. I left the Tabascos, we left the bell peppers, left the shishitos. I've had a lot of people asking me lately about overwintering peppers and perennializing them. I think being a perennial just means, like, perennial means through the years. That's what that word means. And so a perennial is a plant that just grows through multiple seasons, so it survives the winter. What determines if a plant will be a perennial is how cold it gets where you live. So where I live, peppers are not perennials if they're grown outside because it freezes here and peppers die when it freezes. However, I remember going to Baker Creek once and visiting their greenhouses, and one of the girls that works there was telling me there was a guy that used to come and he would come work at Baker Creek's during parts of the year, and he was from South Africa. And when he came in, he asked them where their pepper trees were, because where he lived, peppers grew year round, and they actually grew as tall as trees and big bushes, and every year they would set off more fruit. And here where I live, it freezes, so it doesn't work that way. But if you can keep your peppers from freezing over winter, yes, they will grow into the next year and they will set another round of fruit year after year, and they get really big. And yeah, so you can turn peppers into perennials as long as you can make it warm enough for them. I don't think that's going to work in here because for me, the cost of electricity or setting up solar to try to heat this high tunnel, it's not worth it to get more peppers. I'll just replant them next year. So I'm not going to like fight to keep these. Now I am going to close the walls up of this. I might be able to get them to last deeper into the winter. It just depends on what the winter looks like and how cold it gets. For me though, I'll just harvest what I can get while I can get it, and I'll let them go this winter and start again afresh. I start my pepper seeds in about January and transplant them out by about May. Now here, these beds are freshly amended. We actually did something a little different with that this year because this soil was really loose and sandy and it wasn't holding water well. So I added some manure, some aged manure, some Spangum peat moss, and we mixed it in really well to try to get this to hold a little bit more moisture. And so in here, I'm going to be planting a lot of carrots, a lot of root vegetables here along the edge. I've got some lettuces and kales. I'm going to be doing some salad greens back here, and then we still have to amend over there. And my plan is all the areas that are currently empty are going to be amended and replanted now with those things, those roots and greens and the things that can handle a frost, because I'm not planning on trying to actively heat this greenhouse. The areas where there are currently peppers, when those come out, I think I may stick, I'm not sure, maybe some onions in there. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do with those. I have some pineapple sage. That is frost tender, so we'll see how it does. These are all cabbages of different varieties going all the way back. This bed is full of cabbages, and there are back here, I've put a few different Brussels sprouts back here. And on this side as well, I've got broccoli and cauliflower and some more cabbage here. I've got sweet peas coming up, some basil, also frost tender, so if it does freeze in here, that won't last, but if it doesn't for a while, then I'll have basil into the cooler months. More kale, and down here on the end is some oregano. My hope in planting the high tunnel for the winter was to be able to have things to just pick them when I needed them, Root vegetables aren't quite like fruit. Like if you have peppers, you've got a little while that you can leave those on the plant as they turn colors. But at some point, the quality of that fruit begins to degrade and you need to go ahead and pick it. And so you end up with a lot at once. You got to figure out what to do with it and, you know, canning it or drying it or freezing it, whatever. But with root vegetables, it's a little different. You know, once your beets get to be about 2 inches across, you go ahead and start harvesting those, using them, and you've got some time, and they're gonna grow a little slower through the winter because the sun is not going to be super intense. You just kind of store them out here in the high tunnel, and my hope is to get enough stuff planted and to have staggered it enough that hopefully we can be eating fresh food out of this space until next spring when the spring garden begins to produce again. And my thought is, because normally I would plant out my tomatoes and stuff as soon as the frost passes, and I think what I'm going to do in order to be able to leave this stuff in here past that point so we can continue to eat it is I think that I'm going to plant determinate varieties of tomatoes back here only and put all my indeterminates up in the front so I can get them in the ground right away. I don't know. I'll cross that bridge when I get there. Obviously I have to kind of make some decisions during seed starting time, but I've never felt so confident that I'm going to be able to grow a lot of our food like through the winter. I've grown some in the past. We've done stuff in the ground out front, but this is going to just be a whole nother level of producing our own food. Well guys, I think that pretty much wraps it up for us today. There are a few things that we didn't cover, like we have some kind of random berry plants. We've cleaned out the kids' garden, and we're probably going to just go ahead and throw some roots and greens in there as well. But for the most part, this is really the concentrated part of our food efforts. And as we go on through the season, doing fall garden tours into the winter garden, you know, we're gonna be kind of out and about, and then as the rest of the stuff dies off, we'll kind of move in here. And at that point, this is going to kind of be in its fullness. And I'll show you guys what I am able to grow in this high tunnel over winter here in central Arkansas. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I bless you. Until next time.